I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
Walter Thompson had been Winston Churchill's bodyguard for 8 years, keeping him safe from threats ranging from IRA assassins to Arab mobs and religious fanatics. Their ways had parted when Winston lost office in 1929 as Chancellor of the Exchequer and no longer qualified for official protection. But barely 2 years later, Walter had been asked to take up his duties again and protect Winston during a lecture tour of the United States. For Winston's outspokenness had brought a series of threats to his life from an Indian terrorist organization based in San Francisco. Winston had indeed been severely injured during his first evening in New York, but by an accident rather than an assassin's attack. Now his period of convalescence was at its end, and Winston and Walter must go on their travels with the threat that Winston would not be allowed to leave the United States, dogging their every step. As 1932 began, Walter, Winston, and his family were in the Bahamas, where Churchill was recuperating after being run down in New York. In characteristic fashion, Winston had used his misfortune to his advantage. Phyllis Moyer, the secretary he employed during his trip, later recalled,
"After a few days, he sat up in bed and he dictated a really quite wonderful article on how it feels to be knocked down by a car. He sold it for a much-needed $5,000.
This more than paid for the trip. They stayed at first in a guest house named Polly Leith's, and then with the new governor, Sir Bede Clifford, at Government House. The warm sun and sea helped Winston's recovery, but he was still very slow to mend. 2 weeks after they arrived, his doctor advised him to stay for at least another 10 days. On the 18th of January, Winston wrote to his friend Bernard Baruch, "I am still very weak and have to spend at least 18 hours out of 24 horizontal." And 2 days later, he was telling his son Randolph, "I have not felt like opening the paint box." Probably this came as a relief to Walter, who thoroughly enjoyed the stay, even managing to get a game of soccer with some of the local lads, the first he had played since joining Scotland Yard. Walter was also vastly amused to meet one of the rum runners, who were, as he put it, at the same time enriching and contaminating American life. Prohibition had been in force in the United States for more than 12 years, and a whole industry had grown up illegally importing all sorts of alcohol, across either the long border with Canada or the short sea crossing from the Bahamas Islands to Florida. Fortunes were being made out of smuggling, and demand in the US was huge. But prohibition had been the direct cause of a disastrous collapse in law and order throughout the United States. Criminals such as Al Capone had grown rich. Bribery of police and other law enforcement officers was rife, and turf wars between rival gangs and protection rackets had seen violence and murder spill onto the streets of many US cities. The smuggler introduced Walter to one of his US contacts. Surprisingly, the upright and law-abiding Walter was impressed and not unwilling to follow the advice he was given.
He seemed very civilized. He told me that if either myself or Mr. Churchill wanted a drink any time in New York, just to ask any policeman where the nearest speakeasy could be found. He also gave me a card. Not one of those where you ask for the ever-present and indestructible Joe. It had a phone number if they wanted their order delivered.
Later, back in New York, Walter tried this out and was agreeably surprised.
In less than 10 minutes, the man had come with the goods. Very excellent whiskies, too, and uncut. It would not have been possible to fool Winston about fine whiskey or champagne.
Less agreeably, while in the Bahamas, Walter witnessed an incident which forcibly reminded him of the reason why he was with Winston.
I was leaving the hotel with Winston when a Ford car came very fast round the corner. Winston cringed against the posts of a board fence, terrified. It was the only time I'd seen him in the clutch of old-fashioned fear. He shivered and shook. Sweat poured down his face and darkened his cream-coloured shirt. It was shock. It seemed almost malarial in its symptoms. He looked rather piteously at me and said, "They almost got me that time, Thompson." I looked at him in concern. "This won't do, sir," I said. "You'll have to overcome that." He was silent for a moment, then seemed to make every effort to pull himself physically together. He stepped away from the fence, squared his shoulders, thrust out his famous stubborn lower lip. "You are right, Thompson," he said. "It will not occur again."
The incident was a rude reminder for Walter that once they got back to New York, he would be back to guarding Winston against enemies who showed every sign of being determined to get him. For despite Winston's mishap and the resulting delay, the tour was still on. While Winston was recuperating, his agent had been working hard to reschedule the lectures. Fortunately for the Churchill bank account, he had managed to rearrange about half the venues that had originally been scheduled. So Churchill faced a heavy workload for a man who was still not fully recovered from his accident. The Churchill party sailed back into New York Harbor on the 25th of January 1932. Phyllis Forbes was standing by at the Waldorf Astoria and gave an entertaining account of their arrival. A terrific commotion in the hall outside heralded the Churchills' arrival. Their comings and goings were always accompanied by volcanic disturbances. The door of the apartment was ceremoniously opened by the manager, and the Churchill family trooped in. Diana chattering shrilly, Mrs. Churchill telling Mr. Churchill he ought to lie down, and Mr. Churchill calling loudly for his mail, his secretary, and a scotch and soda. Even before he had left the ship from Nassau, Winston had been filmed with his agent, starting to drum up interest for the delayed tour.
You in Nassau? Well, I'm very glad to be back myself. I hope I'm going to have better luck this time in New York. I hope I shall be able to do all this hard work you've planned for me. At any rate, I shall try my best. You may be sure of that.
And the interviews and filming continued as soon as he got back to the hotel, beginning with some carefully staged questions.
I'm very glad that you are back, Mr. Churchill. How did you enjoy yourself in Nassau? I had a fine time there. Plenty of sunshine and plenty of sand and sea. It did me a lot of good, but I needed it. I had a hard bump. Harder bump, I think, than most people would like to take. I feel very much better, and I think I'm going to be able to get through my task. It's a pretty hard task you're setting me. I shall know a good deal about the geography of the United States before I finish. Hustle.
He then went on to promote some of the themes of his lecture tour.
I'm going to talk in the United States, first of all, on what I call the pathway of the English-speaking people. Their past, their present, their gloomy past, their harassed present, but their hopeful future. And I'm also going to talk about this economic problem, which ought to cause us all continuous thought.
For the Great Depression, which had followed the stock market crash of October 1929, was still in full flood. The economic crisis may have affected the Churchill family fortunes, but he had always had the resilience and resources to fight back. Although whether Winston could have ever anticipated that while doing so, he would put his life at such risk is unlikely. Winston might now be facing a crisis, but with Walter back again as his bodyguard, the likelihood was that he would come through unscathed. For many less fortunate people throughout the industrialized world, the previous 2 years had been an unmitigated disaster. By the end of 1931, unemployment in the United States had reached 15 million, and the government of Herbert Hoover seemed to have no solutions to the problem other than to tighten monetary policy and drive even more businesses to the wall. Beggars thronged the streets, and soup kitchens were set up to try to keep people from actually starving at the curbside. Churchill had always been an avid believer in free trade and in the minimum of interference with international commerce, and he was ready, even eager, to give people the benefit of his often stimulating thinking. As Walter also noted in his journal, he could also be deeply generous with his often scarce money as well.
How human Winston could really be was evident in connection with my own family. Whilst at Chartwell, I was called to the telephone. At the time, I was in the garden with Winston, and when I returned, he asked me if there was anything wrong, as it was unusual for me to be called to the telephone. I informed him that the school doctor had examined my eldest daughter and said that the middle ear was gone and she would be deaf for life. She was then 8 years old. "We'll see about that, Thompson," he said. And straight away he went to the telephone, spoke to his Harley Street specialist and arranged an appointment to see my daughter. Following the examination by the specialist and a subsequent operation for the removal of her tonsils and adenoids, which was all that was wrong, my daughter, now over 40, has perfect hearing. Winston paid all the fees. I have much to thank him for.
2 years earlier, just before the Wall Street crash, Churchill had been able to tour the United States as a private citizen without any problem and without needing to take Walter or any other bodyguard with him. But things had changed. While he had been recuperating in the Bahamas, the possibility of trouble once he got on the road had increased steadily. Threatening letters had continued to pour in from various Indian nationalist groups and individuals, vowing that he would not be allowed to leave the United States alive. reason why Walter must now guard Winston from the threat of assassination was Churchill's decision to make himself the leading opponent of any form of self-rule for India. As Walter noted in his journal, he was thus not only ensuring his own political isolation, but stirring up dangerous passions.
I naturally followed Winston's speeches in the House of Commons and felt very upset when I realised that even the members of his own party were giving him the shoulder. Many did not approve of his ideas regarding India, and the bill before the House of Commons to give them Dominion status was viewed with extreme disfavour by Winston. He fought against the passing of the Government of India Bill, fought it to the bitter end.
In February 1931, Churchill had described Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of Indian demands for independence, in a widely reported speech, as a seditious lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East, striding half-naked up the steps of the vice-regal palace to parley on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor. As Walter noted in his journal, the outrage and resentment which this caused was the direct explanation for the flood of threats against Churchill's life.
Winston, in his speeches on the India Bill, had not helped to discourage the members of this terrorist society. And when he put forward arguments to show that Indians were not fit to govern, the members of that society were instructed to assassinate him.
In retrospect, it is difficult to understand why Winston threw himself with such passion and determination against an idea which was supported by all three parties in Parliament. But one has to remember that he was an old-fashioned romantic, and that some of the formative years of his life had been spent in India, when the British Raj seemed to be at its height. Winston had arrived in India as a newly commissioned officer with his regiment, the 4th Hussars, in early 1896, just 8 months before Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. It was the high point of her empire. Both he and Walter, in their different ways, were true children of this empire. For both, Britannia ruled the waves, and a quarter of the globe was painted red. As a young officer based in India, Winston spent surprisingly little time there during the 3 years he was nominally serving with the 4th Hussars. Not only did he manage to fit in 2 home leaves, each of several months, plus the long voyages to and from Britain, but he also used his mother's political and social connections to get away from his regiment on attachment to 2 notable military campaigns. The first was an expedition to put down rebellious Pathan tribesmen in the Swat Valley, close to the border with Afghanistan. 3 brigades of Indian Army troops had been formed into the splendidly named Malakand Field Force, led by the even more splendidly named Major General Sir Bindon Blood. Having met Blood at a race meeting at Goodwood while on home leave in June 1897, Winston had extracted a loose promise that he might accompany him. This made him race back to India and get permission from his colonel to go, despite a less than encouraging telegram from Blood saying, "Very difficult, no vacancies, come up as a correspondent. We'll try to fit you in. BB." Afghanistan had been a focus of military and political rivalry between the expanding British and Russian empires for more than half a century. Nominally a single kingdom, it was in reality a patchwork of competing tribes and warlords, and seemed to offer ample opportunities for empire building. For the Russians, the country represented an opportunity to move down towards both the Middle East and the Indian Ocean, and to cause trouble to their imperial rival Britain. For the British, it was a vital buffer on the northwest frontier of their Indian Empire. 2 British expeditions against what passed for a central government of Afghanistan in Kabul had utterly failed to achieve any control. The local tribes had been warring for centuries. They united only when they turned happily and ferociously to defeat any invader. In 1842, an entire 15,000-man British army was wiped out, save for 1 survivor. By the end of the century, a variety of British and Russian spies and political advisers were locked in a great game of intrigue and plotting. At best, the British aimed to keep Russian influence at bay, while putting down any frontier tribe which became too unruly. The Malakand Field Force was just the latest of these expeditions, and Churchill spent 6 weeks in the autumn of 1897 on what was by all accounts a grueling and bloody little campaign. He had taken Blood's advice to come up as a correspondent and was contracted by both the Indian newspaper The Pioneer and the British Daily Telegraph. But more important than the articles which appeared in both papers was the book which Winston wrote on his experiences, The Story of the Malakand Field Force. His first publication, it got good reviews, considerable publicity, and a letter of recommendation from the Prince of Wales. Many other junior officers in the British Army would have fought to get on an expedition like this, but few would have turned their experience into a book within months of returning to their regiment. Winston repeated the trick the following year. The commander of the nominally independent Egyptian army, the British General Sir Herbert Kitchener, was planning an expedition to reconquer the Sudan from the successors of the Mahdi who had massacred General Gordon at Khartoum in 1885. Winston was determined to join the expedition, and Kitchener was equally determined that the medal-hunting and publicity-seeking young whippersnapper should not. Winston's mother lobbied furiously on his behalf, appealing amongst others to the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, the powerful British political agent in Egypt, Lord Cromer, and the Adjutant General of the British Army, Sir Evelyn Wood. Faced with this barrage, Kitchener took the convenient opportunity of the death of a young subaltern in one of his regiments, the 21st Lancers, to agree that Winston could be attached to it as a temporary replacement. But he must travel at his own expense, and the army would take no responsibility if he got himself killed. Armed with a good journalistic commission from the British Morning Post newspaper, Winston raced from London, where he was again on leave, to get to the 21st Lancers as Kitchener's army advanced slowly down the Nile towards Khartoum. With the regiment, he took part on the 2nd of September 1898 in what is often, but incorrectly, claimed to be the last charge of a British cavalry regiment at the Battle of Omdurman. During this, Winston claimed to have killed several dervishes, 3 for certain, 2 doubtful. With the Sudan reconquered, Winston returned to England, and within months was completing his 2-volume history of the Sudan campaign, The River War. He was also planning his future, for he had decided to leave the army for politics, and before leaving for India again in December 1898, he had resigned his commission. This was the last time he was ever to be in India, and much of his time was spent playing polo for the regiment and helping it to win the Army Championship. He then wound up his affairs in India and left Bombay on the 20th of March, 1898, just 30 months after he had first arrived there. This, then, was the sum total of Winston's experience of the country, which was now putting his life at such appalling risk. For the next 32 years, Churchill's attitude to India, the country which had come close to ruining his career and now threatened his life, remained locked in a late Victorian time warp. The country was the jewel in the imperial crown, the key to the future strength of the British Empire. Since Winston believed the Indians to be incapable of governing themselves, the Queen Empress and her successors would rule, and the Indians would benefit from the civilizing influence of the British. This view was reinforced more than 12 years after Winston had left India, when a magnificent Durbar celebrated the accession of King George V as Emperor of India. The princes pledged their loyalty, the Indian army paraded, and the empire seemed as though its sun would never set. But the reality was that even while Churchill was still in India, the foundations of this apparently eternal edifice were being undermined. Some 40 years earlier, the Indian Mutiny had shown that British rule was not universally popular. To a great extent, the survival of the empire since then had depended on the judicious use of politics to keep opposition disunited and maintain the support of interested parties, such as the princes, and ruthless force when necessary to put down any opposition. The Indian Congress Party, dedicated to achieving independence for India, had been founded in 1885. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the Indian Army was deployed for use overseas, and many Indians flocked loyally to join up. But many of those who worked to support Britain did so in the hope that after the war was over, they would be rewarded by moves towards self-government and eventually full independence. Prominent amongst these was Mohandas Gandhi, who had studied law in London and at first attempted to become as English as possible. But while training, his politics became increasingly radical, and he began to question the moral basis of Britain's rule over India. Gandhi had supported the British war effort during World War I. But even while helping to recruit troops for the Indian Army, he made it quite clear that he was totally opposed to the continuation of British rule once the war was over. The optimism of many Indians that their loyalty to Britain would be rewarded at the end of a war in which 62,000 of their countrymen had died fighting at first seemed to be justified when the British Parliament passed a Government of India Act. This shared power between an elected Indian legislature and an appointed British governing council. Although not giving away any real power, the Act seemed to suggest that self-government might eventually be achieved. But any goodwill created was immediately squandered when the British-controlled government pushed through a replacement for the security provisions which had been introduced during the war. The Rowlatt Acts, as they were called, introduced press censorship, detention of suspects without trial, and the trying of political cases without a jury. Immediately, Gandhi, who had become the effective leader of the Congress Party, began to organize opposition to the acts. He was determined that these should be peaceful, but to the British authorities, the mass demonstrations which swiftly spread across the country seemed increasingly threatening. On the 13th of April 1919, a detachment of Gurkha troops commanded by Brigadier General Reginald Dyer opened fire on a crowd of unarmed demonstrators which had gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh compound in Amritsar. 379 people were killed and more than 1,200 injured. As news of the massacre spread, the view of many Indians that the British were enlightened, if strict rulers, changed radically into a belief that they were an occupying power which must be got rid of. Churchill was the Minister of War who had to react to this inexplicable but appalling act. Dyer was recalled, subjected to a formal inquiry, and then dismissed from the army. Many people in Britain felt that Dyer should have been rewarded rather than punished for his prompt action, but Churchill held firm. But this swift action did little to alter the hatred most influential Indians now felt for their rulers, or to persuade Churchill that further changes must now be made. Over the next 10 years, Gandhi continued his campaign to lead India towards total independence. But his largely peaceful protest movement did little to change Churchill's mind that India must remain British. In 1930, just after Winston had ceased to be a minister, Gandhi deliberately broke the laws which made it a crime to buy or possess salt which had not been bought from a government-owned monopoly. He led hundreds of followers on a 200-mile march to the sea, which took 24 days. Early on the morning of the 6th of April 1930, Gandhi picked up some salt left by the waves. Later, it was sold for 1,600 rupees. Within days, hundreds of thousands of Indians were making their own salt. As a result, more than 60,000 people were imprisoned and several were killed in rioting. Over 2,000 of Gandhi's followers allowed themselves to be beaten up by the police in a powerful show of non-violence. On the 5th of May, as his followers continued to defy the authorities and make their own salt, Gandhi was arrested and imprisoned without trial. But the British government had realized that the situation in India was dangerously close to anarchy and decided to call a round-table conference to discuss its future. 9 months after he had been arrested, Gandhi was released and travelled triumphantly to London to take part. He continued to wear his simple loincloth and cloak and stayed in an East End settlement house for the homeless, because he said that he preferred living amongst his own kind.
It has been a matter of the greatest pleasure to me to be in the midst of the poor people of the East End of London. Whatever the result of the mission that brought me to London, I know that I shall carry with me the pleasantest memories of my stay in the midst of the poor people of East London.
Gandhi outraged many people in Britain when he went for tea with the King and Queen still wearing his loincloth. As he said afterwards, the King had enough on for both of us. It was Gandhi's appearance at the conference that provoked Winston into his outraged remark about the half-naked fakir, and inspired the death threats which meant that Walter had to be recruited as bodyguard for his lecture tour to the United States. During the voyage across the Atlantic, Walter witnessed personally the strength of Winston's feelings which had now put his life in such jeopardy.
At times, however, he was very moody, and he would walk up and down the deck for some time without a word being spoken. He must have been thinking about the Government of India Bill, for on 2 occasions he burst out with "Utter folly, Thompson, utter folly, to give them dominion status. I will oppose it to the bitter end."
What worried Walter was that the Indian assassins might soon make Winston's words all too true. Now it was up to Walter to keep Winston safe, as the delayed and shortened version of the tour began on the 28th of January at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. More than 2,000 people, including Mario Contasino, the driver who had run him down in Fifth Avenue, gathered to hear Churchill extolling the need for greater ties between the British Empire and the United States. The other great theme he had selected for the tour was the world economic crisis. There are no recordings of Winston's lectures, but this filmed interview gives a flavor of his style and themes.
It is surely a great mystery that we should all be so much poorer now than we were 2 or 3 years ago. Why should the whole world suddenly have got so much poorer? There has been peace, there has been no pestilence, no violent convulsion of nature. Bounteous harvests have rewarded the toil of man, the demand of the great consuming public is here today. The machinery of science stands ready to supply that demand. How is it that all of a sudden there should be this breakdown in the whole of our apparatus of progress? Surely we ought to be able to find some way out of this difficulty. In my opinion, there are many ways out of it. But there is no way out of it unless there is real guidance and leadership. Unless behind that guidance and leadership there is gathered a combination of forces, a merging of forces, of world forces, powerful enough to dominate the situation and to restore order and design to a world which is falling into chaos and incoherence. I hope in my economic discussion here to rouse opinion to the need of cooperation between the leading nations to restore the financial and credit situation of the world. And when I say the leading nations, I mean first of all the English-speaking peoples to whom my counsels are primarily addressed.
Churchill allowed himself 2 days of rest after this first lecture. But on Sunday, the 31st of January, the grind began when Walter, Winston and Clementine set off by train from Grand Central Station to Hartford, Connecticut. Arriving shortly after midday, Winston, Clementine and Diana were greeted by a representative of the Mark Twain Memorial and Library Commission and taken to lunch. Then at 3:30 in the afternoon, Winston mounted the dais at Bushnell Auditorium, where Connecticut's governor, Wilbur Cross, introduced him to another audience of more than 2,000 people. For the next 6 weeks, they crisscrossed the eastern United States from north to south.
Night after night, Winston addressed large audiences. Wherever we went, there were always 2 Ford cars ready to take us anywhere we wished to go. What a boon this was. Backwards and forwards we went by train, day after day.
Springfield, Massachusetts, St. Louis, Chicago, Cleveland, Toledo, then to Detroit, and back to Chicago again. Returning to New York, Winston spoke first at Carnegie Hall and then at the Hotel Astor. The speech at the Hotel Astor was in front of the New York Economic Club. The audience included John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. Secretary of State of the Treasury. The final question put to Winston was the most sensational.
He was asked, "What would you do if we nominated you to run for the presidency?" There was a moment of astonished silence. Then Mr. Churchill smiled. "Gentlemen," he replied, "there is a great deal of difference between my nomination and election. But if my father had been American-born rather than my mother, I would have got there on my own." What a wonderful reaction came to this reply. The following day, the American press hailed him as a genius.
While back in New York, Winston also went on an excursion to the top of the newly completed Empire State Building with Al Smith, one of the candidates for the presidency. There they were heard exchanging such profound observations as, "I have never been so high before, and I don't suppose I shall ever get any higher myself." Then it was on via Rochester to Washington. In the U.S. Capitol, Winston and his party stayed at the British Embassy, where the ultra-punctilious ambassador, Sir Ronald Lindsay, found Winston's unconventional working habits somewhat difficult to cope with. As Phyllis Moyer later remembered, the two made the oddest contrast, the immensely dignified diplomat standing extremely ill at ease at the foot of the old-fashioned four-poster, and the Peter Pan of British politics sitting up in bed, a cigar in his mouth, his tufts of red hair as yet uncombed, scanning the morning newspapers. Winston stayed for almost a week and gave 2 lectures. He also called on President Herbert Hoover at the White House. After a lunch in his honor, given by the Washington Press Club on the 16th of February, it was back on the road. Nashville, New Orleans, Cincinnati, Grand Rapids, Indianapolis, Ann Arbor, Atlanta, Boston, and finally back to New York.
It was a veritable Churchill triumph, although an anxious time for me.
For everywhere they went, they were haunted by messages from the Indian terrorists which kept Walter constantly on edge.
We got about 700 threatening letters. These we turned over to the police of whatever city we were in.
But Walter had been instructed not to give the US police any details of the information Scotland Yard had received, for fear of compromising its informants. So he was only able to give the local police the most general warnings, although often these had the desired result.
At any meeting where I saw Indians, I would ask the local police either to remove them or to have someone sit beside them. This was often carried out in a manner which, although extremely effective, would never have been tolerated in England.
But despite these precautions, there were some moments when Walter had to take more drastic action.
After meetings in Chicago and Detroit, at which on each occasion an Indian would appear at the entrance to the hall, I had to draw my gun, as in each case they were approaching Mr. Churchill. The police in each case took them away, after I had explained that they might have caused trouble in view of Winston's opposition to the India Bill in England.
Throughout their time in Detroit, Walter was on tenterhooks, since Indian students demonstrated outside the hall where Winston was to appear.
Our car was twice stoned and filth was dumped in our hotel.
The danger persisted right up to the end of their trip.
A few hours before our departure, the American Secret Service sent me an urgent message saying the Indian terrorists were still claiming that Winston will not get out of the United States alive.
But Walter was well up to the task of foiling them.
We contacted the shipping company, who arranged to pick up our baggage, and at the last minute Winston and I slipped out of the staff entrance of the hotel and got aboard without incident.
Once again, Walter had safely got Winston back to Britain, where he had to leave him again and return to the boring business of trailing communists and other extremists, such as Sir Oswald Mosley's newly created fascists. He might have been unable to save Winston from the car in New York, but he did have the satisfaction of knowing that he had protected him on several occasions when assassination seemed a real possibility. As Walter noted, the worst had been during their second visit to Chicago.
After his lecture, Winston began to talk with various admirers in the entrance hall, which was closed from the street by glass swing doors. The local detectives were standing on the pavement outside, so I was surprised when suddenly a well-dressed Indian hurried through the swing doors and made straight for Winston, keeping one hand in his pocket. I pulled my gun and advanced on him. He spun round and crashed into the glass doors behind me, with such force as to pass clear through the shattered frame and right into the arms of the two detectives. At the same time, another Indian who'd been lurking outside sprinted away down the street.
The Indian who Walter had spotted and who had acted so suspiciously was identified as a leading lawyer, and no charges could be brought. But Walter had no doubt that he had been after Churchill. It was a satisfactory way to end what both men must have thought would be their last time together. For Winston was now approaching 60 and falling out more and more with the leadership of his party. The prospect of him regaining office and being given a bodyguard seemed remote. Walter, too, was becoming increasingly disenchanted with his job, not least by the discovery that by serving Winston so loyally for so many years, his promotion prospects had been considerably damaged. Over the next few years, their ways were to part. But it was far from being the end of their time together. For new and sinister forces were beginning to stir. Italian fascism was about to be overtaken by a more dangerous and virulent form of extreme authoritarianism. In Germany, as Walter and Winston said goodbye to each other, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party had become the second largest bloc in the Reichstag, and he was preparing to challenge Paul von Hindenburg for the presidency. It was too early yet to see Hitler as a new great threat to Winston Churchill, but the writing was on the wall.